This is House Planning Help episode 188. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that could get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Richard Hawkes from Hawkes Architecture, and we're going to be exploring paragraph 55. If that means nothing to you, it's a very specific part of the National Planning Policy Framework, and it's about getting a new house built in the countryside, which is near impossible, but not impossible. It's a slightly longer interview as well today, so I think that's one reason why we just need to get straight into it. And I asked Richard to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his career.
Well, I'm Richard Hawkes. I set up Hawkes Architecture 9 years ago. And before I set up Hawkes Architecture, I worked in London as an architect in large commercial practice. And then as I was sort of developing as an architect, I suppose, or getting involved with smaller, more bespoke projects, bought a piece of land, had the chance to do our own house, wanted to have low running costs, and thought it might be, good opportunity to find some good local builders and craftsmen that I might be able to then use on maybe get some other work. Maybe in one day I might have my own practice.
Are you trying to tell me that this almost launched you and your practice?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow,
yeah.
okay.
It was one of those kind of very small thoughts in my head. I never thought I'd really have my own practice. It was kind of humble ambitions. And when we had the opportunity to do the house, obviously I followed through a design process that felt very strong to me. I had a very supportive wife as well. And I look at this house now and, we love living here, and it still gives me as much of a thrill today as it did when I did it. And we had that opportunity to build our own house. And even though now we design private houses for people all over the country, I still look at this and think, wow, when I had the opportunity to do it myself, I really took it. I wasn't shy. I wasn't scared of it. I grabbed the opportunity properly. And so I still look at the arch, still stand under the arch and look at it and go, wow, that took some guts.
What was the inspiration for it?
For the arch? Well, actually, the arch didn't appear until the third model when I started developing the building in 3D. But interestingly, the process we followed still today as a studio is still very similar to what I did for this house here, whereby there are kind of two distinct processes going along in parallel. One of them is responding to your client. So my wife had some certain ideas about how she wanted the house laid out. There's some obvious things about where the best views are and things like that. So, and wanting it to have low running costs, taking some of the ideas like putting support spaces on the north side, knowing that you want the north side of the house to be more solid, open it up to the south, to the views, to the sun. That starts helping to lay out what I call the mechanics of a plan. And then as a separate process, I'm walking all the lanes and walking the roads, all the approaches, how you can see this site, how this site fits in its setting. And from there's 4 different ways of approaching this site. So there's no natural front or back. And each of those views kind of requires a different response. So from the west, it's got very different requirements of the conversation it needs to have with the west, to the north, to the east, to the southwest where the views are. So I'm kind of in minutiae detail analysing how the landscape changes as you approach the house from all these different directions and thinking, what does the house need to do kind of sculpturally to respond to those? So once I've got a really fine understanding of that, how we need to respond in context, and we've got the mechanics of the plan together, those two processes start coming together and something starts growing out of it. And that was when the modelling exercise started. So the first model was a kind of an extrusion of the plan I was developing. And for example, on the first model, because I knew there was the best view, the lounge was here, I flared the walls out so the lounge was wider out towards the view, because in plan it looked like an expression of it's telling you where the best view is. But when you model it, it made the house look like a megaphone. It just looked like the lounge and the bedroom just looked like a big megaphone, so it just felt quite clumsy. So the second model was a rationalisation, pulling these things back in. And there were this distinct central objects with a space in between, which is the kind of central corridor. So you've got those bathrooms, utility room on the north side, and then the big habitable spaces on the south side. And there was a space in between, which was the corridor. And then at each end, there were these wings with spaces at the end. And the west view, when you come down from the west, a car, is looking straight at the house for quite a while. So the headlights would be shining right at the house. So I didn't want any lights shining in the house at night. I didn't want to spoil the darkness, the lovely darkness to get in the evening. But equally, I wanted to help lock the building into the context from that view. I thought a really nice way of doing that is to have part of it living, so that it changes with the seasons and helps the building kind of assimilate. So I thought, well, okay, if I want to grow stuff, what do I want to grow? Well, I want to grow the stuff that you see around. Then I thought, well, I'm going to need clay. I'm going to need quite a lot of clay. Clay's heavy. Lots of clay is going to mean lots of structure. Lots of structure is going to be expensive. What's the best way of holding up lots of weight? An arch. And then it was literally 5 o'clock on Sunday morning. I woke up and literally had it was one of those kind of, So these wings that were at the end of the building, which were kind of secondary elements to what the modelling was showing, all of a sudden became the dominant element. So there was this arch. So I literally peeled the land up to create the arch, and then these other buildings have slid underneath. And all of a sudden, just that move, all the pennies dropped, everything locked together. It was kind of fantastic. The form just seemed to answer all the things from the north, east, south and west. The fact that these buildings kind of slotted in underneath, there was a sense of the house being like a bird hide. We always wanted the ecology and the biodiversity to come in round us and feel like we're sitting in amongst it. One of the analogies I use for the house is kind of like a Victorian photographer, where they've got that black hood over their back and they're looking out of this box out and looking out of the lens, and the house is kind of like that. The master bedroom is this projecting camera lens, hence the lounge has got all this glass here, no structure to kind of accentuate that feeling of the master bedroom cantilevering out. From that third model, that kind of locked most things together, and then all the subsequent models were trying to find out what the rest of the personality of the building could and should be, then what materials we should use and all that, and that was all about giving the building a sense of place. But it was actually the first planning application we put in, it wasn't a tiled vault. It was actually part of a circle with the centre line being 4 metres below ground, only because I couldn't draw parabolas. And it was only after we got planning consent that I met Michael Ramage at Cambridge University, and it was Andrew Bassant from Equilibrium Solutions, the guy who built the Pines Calyx domes, with Michael Ramage at Cambridge and Phil Cooper. And then it was Andrew said to me, have you heard of this technique of gluing tiles together with plaster of Paris? Here we were sitting in our old house, 420-year-old house, and I'm effectively interviewing a potential builder. And I've got this builder talking to me about this technique of gluing clay tiles together with plaster of Paris. And I was just like, wow, that sounds amazing. Get in touch with Cambridge University, he said. So I did, and then when we commissioned them to do a feasibility study, they came back and said, yeah, that can work. And I was hooked then. It was just got to make it happen.
And you weren't ever worried that this was all on Grand Designs, and it sounds quite experimental too at the same time, sort of make or break.
Well, it's interesting. Lots of people have put it like that, and I think, oh, crikey, yeah, I suppose. But it didn't feel to me like I was being that crazy, because I'd met the only builder in the country who had familiarity with using this technique. I went to Cambridge University, kind of only engineers in the world who know this technique and are familiar with it and have used it. I commissioned Cambridge University to do a study. My structural engineers are actually Scott Wilson. Philip Cooper worked at Scott Wilson, so it was their PI. They subcontracted Cambridge University. So as far as I'm concerned, I thought, well, I've got the right, it's not like I'm just got a few guys together, sit around a table and come up with something. And we tested it, and yeah, it works. So I had every faith in it, bonkers as it was, and as it was going up, and the traumas that kind of the cameras caught as well, showing the fragility of it as well as the amazing strength of it. It's a wonderful story because it the construction process did reveal how careful you've got to be, but equally it did reveal how amazingly strong this technique is. So it didn't feel daft to me.
Let's fast forward then, because you did set up your practice, and what seems to have been interesting over the years is that you've developed a speciality for something particular in planning and trying to get consent on, well, maybe this is where we need to start. What is this paragraph 55?
Yeah, well, paragraph 55 is a piece of policy that was introduced 20 years ago this year, and it was John Gummer introduced it in 1997 as a paragraph 3.21. It was a piece of national policy that said if you had a piece of land, and it was intending the idea that if someone's got 200 acres and they want their English country house, it was a piece of policy that could enable that to happen, because it's part of a strong tradition in Britain, the English country house. Because generally, since planning came in 1946 or 46, 47, generally we're trying to avoid new homes in the countryside. And then in 2003, the Labour government wanted to get rid of the policy because they felt it was an elitist piece of policy. They felt it was just rich man's toy, this piece of policy. There was quite a lot of lobbying from the RBA and lots of eminent architects saying it's really important that this piece of policy can help move forward dwelling design. Even though most of the original English country houses that were coming out of this policy were classical, large English country houses, 30-odd thousand square feet. But the policy stayed in, but it got changed, and it then became PPS 7, paragraph 11. So these houses got known as PPS 7 houses for a long while. This was one of them. That policy.
So your house was one?
It was not a pure one, because there was a bungalow here. But the local planning policies say, well, you can replace a dwelling with another dwelling, but it shouldn't be any more visually obtrusive. And by that, they generally go by scale. They allow maybe usually 50%, although this authority didn't have a number against that. But they generally treat that as a bit of a rule. But what you can't do is go twice as big and twice as high, which is what we did. So the local policy doesn't allow that. So the only policy that existed at that time to catch and facilitate this getting consent, as it was PPS 7, paragraph 11. So it was a softer PPS 7, if you like, but it certainly needed that policy to get consent. If the policy wasn't there, there's no policy for it to be able to get consent. But that started us on this road of being associated with this piece of policy. The Grand Designs process, not that they talked about PPS 7 at that point, obviously helped. And then when I started the business up, we started getting phone calls from people who had pieces of land that didn't have dwellings on, or did have small dwellings on, and they wanted bigger dwellings. And we started picking up some projects, and fortunately getting planning consent for them, and now we're kind of very rigorous about the way we go about this.
Well, we'll dig into that.
Yeah.
Firstly, are there a set of criteria that says, well, this is allowed, but that isn't?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, paragraph 55 of the National Planning Policy Framework says that planning authorities should generally seek to resist new dwellings in the countryside. But paragraph 55 has 4 bullet points in it, 4 special circumstances that can facilitate a new dwelling in the countryside. One of them is a rural worker, key worker dwelling, agricultural workers dwelling, agricultural tie, as some people might know it. So that's quite tricky to do, because the size of the dwelling has to relate to the income of the business and has to represent a genuine need for someone to be on site. So you can't just sort of say, well, I'm growing wheat, I need to be here. Even if you've got cattle, it's kind of, you don't need to be there if you've got cattle. So it's quite difficult to create a business case to actually say, I need to be there. So they don't happen very often. Then there's the reuse of a redundant or derelict heritage asset. So if you've got a listed building that's crumbling away, saving it can be a way of getting a planning consent for a dwelling. The third one is the reuse of redundant farm buildings. And that's kind of been superseded by the change in permitted development. So lots of farmers have been converting farm buildings and getting dwellings very easily. So it's kind of made the third bullet point of paragraph 55 mute for now. And then the fourth bullet point, which has got what most of my business is all about, says the next special circumstances if the dwelling is of exceptional quality or innovative in its nature of design. And then it says such a design should be truly outstanding or innovative in its nature of design, helping to raise the standards of design more generally in rural areas. It should be the high standards in architecture. And it should significantly enhance its immediate setting and be sensitive to the defining characteristics of the local area. So there's in that fourth bullet point, there are fundamentally 4 tests. It has to pass all those tests. So it's a beautiful bit of policy because fundamentally what it tells you to do is the planning, it's national policy basically saying, look guys, come on architects, here's a piece of policy. If you do something well enough, you can, in theory, put a house anywhere. The truth is, finding sites that have got what we call the right ingredients to be able to pass the tests is far more complex.
Is this subjective as well? I'm sure. Can you rewind over what those things were once more?
So the tests within bullet point 4 are that a dwelling needs to be of exceptional quality or
exceptional quality.
Yeah, exceptional quality.
What does that mean?
Well, we can get onto that.
Okay.
Exceptional quality or innovative in its nature of design. So helping to raise the standards of design more generally in rural areas. So it's basically recognising the fact that dwelling design, despite changes in regulation, is still pretty mediocre generally, nationally. The highest standards in architecture is the second test. And then the third test is significantly enhance the immediate setting and be sensitive to the defining characteristics of the local area. It's basically telling you have to get under the skin of a place, understand what makes it tick, what it's all about, not on a superficial level. You've got to understand its ecology, its biodiversity, its resources.
Walk down the roads.
Walk down the roads, exactly. It's exactly. I intuitively was doing this because for me, the context of any site has got rich things for you to respond to. You've just got to find them. So it takes months to get under the skin of a site. You have to, the reports, the surveys that you have to do. We don't just do them to tick a box to get validation in a planning. We commission these tools to help us understand what the site's about. Who lives here? What animals live here? What things could be here or should be here but aren't here? And why aren't they there? What's the sun doing? What's the prevailing wind direction? Is there something unusually climatically here? What's the geology?
Have you got an example that you could share that would just give us an idea of how finding out those things has then been an influence to the house?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, hopefully all of our sites have got a story to tell. But there's one we're working on at the moment down near Portsmouth. It's not gone into planning yet, but the client got in touch with us. They had high ambitions for the house. They said, we love Flint House. And I said, oh, okay, the Mansa winning house for the Rothschild family. Great. Yeah, that's a nice place to set your sights. And as it happens, down near Portsmouth, there's lots of flint. And clearly what we can't do is Flint House, because Flint House has just been done. But they had high ambitions, and they said, why don't we go for the Mansa Prize? I went, well, okay, interesting. And on this site, you look at the site and around the site, there are fields full of chunks of flint. There are big dips in on the site, which are from quarrying of flint. So flint extraction has become part of the defining characteristics of the area. Flint exists very openly and it's everywhere. Obviously, buildings are using it as well. So then what we do is we want to try and do something different with it. So paragraph 60 of the MPIT National Planning Policy Framework says that local authorities should not seek to impose architectural styles, not seek to stifle innovation, etc., 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 but they should seek to reinforce local distinctiveness. So this is, again, paragraph 60 is a really interesting piece of policy because it's basically saying you don't go around just copying what we used to do. And in any other period of history, buildings reflected the time they were built. But today there's this banal mindset where everything we build is referential. We love the quality that we used to have in buildings, and we despise the lack of sense of place that buildings have now. But it's kind of, we want a red brick, we say red brick, and then we bring it in from Holland, and then wonder why the red brick doesn't look right. Well, it's not the local clay. If you use the local materials, you will embody the building with a sense of place. You don't have to make the building look like an old building. This house, Mike Crossway, everything's local. Even people who say, oh, it is an unusual shaped building, but it does feel right. The sense of place comes from using the local materials. But that's what we always used to do, naturally, instinctively. So this house in Portsmouth, so it's got flint everywhere. It's on the edge of the national park. It's not in the national park, but it's visible from it. So views from the national park are sensitive. So what you don't want is a big white spaceship sitting in its location, because it would clearly be odd. Flint is an interesting material, and it's got wonderful qualities. But, on the outside, it's white, soft, and curvy. You break it open, it's black, hard, and sharp. That's a wonderful thing, a wonderful contrast. So we had the thought to take those qualities. We distilled those qualities of the outside and the inside of flint. Then we just flipped them and said, what if the outside were black, hard, and sharp, and the inside were white, soft, and curvy? So we developed an architecture that effectively explored this conceptual notion of flint, and then worked that into an architectural language, which meant that this building took on a characteristic that was black, hard, and sharp on the outside. So sitting in its setting with, when viewed from the national park within a tree line behind, you have a linear building that's something you'd look at and it kind of think, is that an agricultural building? Is it a building that was doing something else once before? From a distance, just nestle in the tree line. And as you get closer to it, obviously you see detailing, you see sharpness, you see crisp things going on, different materials, some flint, but mainly not. But then as you get up closer to the building, and then when these gates open up, you go into a courtyard, and it's white, soft, flowing curves. It's just a whoa, and everything that a Paragraph 55 house should be, but fundamentally rooted in an expression of flint, which is something that is defining characteristic of the local area. So there's a sensitivity to those defining characteristics, and we're looking at the significant enhancement to the immediate setting is done through, obviously the introduction of a high quality building, and buildings can and often do enhance a landscape. This is an interesting point of discussion often in planning. I'll get back to your point about subjectivity in a second as well.
Haven't forgotten that one.
But equally, we're enhancing the landscape through binding the site together with areas of woodland, seeing where enhancements can happen to link habitats, to bolster woodland edge, increase biodiversity through introduction of wildflower areas, but actually a proper mowing regime so you can starve the nutrients to actually increase the biodiversity, put management plans in place and offer those with the application. So a Paragraph 55 application isn't just about a house, it's about the land, very much so. It's the landscape and the architecture working very much together. You can't take any part of the strategy away, it all works holistically together. So sometimes a site might have plenty of woodland being planted or already in place, which requires management. If it's got woodland and it requires management, there will be a cordage of wood, a quantity of wood that would sustainably need to be taken out of the site to properly manage that woodland. Woodland needs management. So then with that wood, what do you do with that wood? Well, if you can use that in the building, burning, you don't have to burn logs, but it can be a very useful way of actually creating a nice sustainable cycle. So the nature of the site and its management will also often tie into the energy strategy that we develop for an individual building.
Innovation also sometimes sounds expensive. So are we still saying that this is slightly elitist? Do you have to have a big checkbook to be able to get one of these projects? Or are there examples of very small houses, or does it have to then go back to that worker's cottage on site? Are those the only ones that are the small? These ones, are they more grand projects?
Well, the policy doesn't stipulate anything to do with size. And the smallest one we've got consent for under the policy was 240 square metres. It was a 4-bedroom house, but a modest size house, relatively. But a house of the high standards in architecture of exceptional quality will be one that has lots of insulation. We recognise that energy is expensive and that buildings should be more aware of the amount of energy they use. Dwellings use a lot of energy. Most of 65% of the typical house is energy goes on heating, and most of that energy is used during the November, December, January, February period. So this type of house with a ski jacket on, passive house type buildings, use obviously dramatically less energy. So lots of insulation, heat recovery, ventilation, triple glazing, all those, and passive solar gain and all those sort of passive house principles. That's just sensible design. Those don't become the reasons it should get consent.
But are they looking for that as a foundation?
Absolutely.
Almost?
Yeah,
Oh, good.
absolutely
good,
right.
good.
Yeah, it's not, you can't put a paragraph 55 scheme together just to building regs and say, yeah, but look how nice it looks. It doesn't work like that. So back to your point about subjectivity. If you got 100 people in a room and showed them this house, Crossway, or showed them any of the houses that we've designed, you will obviously get a very wide range of opinions about those houses. Anybody's response to design will always inherently be subjective, but the principles of good design can be looked at entirely objectively. So the process of design is really important distinction. The process of design can be looked at entirely objectively. And what we have done is develop effectively a DNA in the studio, framework to design. And it starts off with rigorous understanding of the site and the client. Every site and every client are different. So every building will inevitably be different. It's not just that we kind of think, what we're going to do next, guys. The process will take us there. We won't know what we're designing for somebody for months. And they accept that now, but they see that we've got enough buildings and we've been through this process enough that we've got a portfolio that demonstrates that diversity. When I just had Crossway, that's not really something that you can sell. So we've got that now. So people can trust that if they follow our process, they will end up with something that will exceed their expectations and that will be perfect for the site and take on board everything about the lifestyle analysis that we did. We give clients homework. We want to know what time they wake up in the morning. We want to know whether they like the idea of the sun shining through their bedroom window when they wake up in the morning. We want to know whether they have breakfast, lunch and dinner in the same place or whether they move around the house depending on where the sun is. We want to know how often they entertain. It's all very well talking about having a house that's great for entertaining, that can seat 20 people around the dining table at Christmas time. But if that's the only time it happens, it could be a room that feels very strange to be in for the rest of the year and not get used. If a room's not getting used, it's a waste of space. Usually people come along, they want more space than they really need. The pot of money is not quite as big as it needs to be, but they want the Mercedes S-Class quality. So we have to work very hard to make sure the amount of house they want, the size of the amount of money that's in the pot and the quality all line up to their what is most important to that client. So that's an interesting process because everyone comes along wanting the big house with Mercedes S-Class and here's £2.50 to do it with. So not quite, but when you show them, well, this is how much it realistically costs to do a house under Para 55 in this sort of range. Well, you said you want that much house. If I times that by that equals this budget. Oh, I can't spend that much. Okay. Do you want the number to go up? If you want the number to come down, either the amount of house comes down or we can't make it a double glazed house, for example, with building regs levels of insulation. It will have to be a high fabric quality building. But we can architecturally keep the form more rational. So we can keep an eye on expenditure through form to a certain extent. But we can set these things up just to keep an eye on the dynamics of quantity, price and quality. And that before we start designing, that we will go through all those things with the client so that what we're designing is feasible. And the lovely thing is, we aren't just designing these and getting planning consent, they're all being built, which creates its own pressures in the office, but it's a fantastic testament to the fact that we go through these processes. They're not white elephants.
One of our hub members, I sent you away and you went and checked out the site and did your analysis. So under what circumstances do you decide to go ahead versus saying to them, look, I don't think this is the right site? Is it the site that's not right? I suppose it must be, yeah.
It usually is the site, but sometimes, well, the client has to be prepared to go through this as well. And it's a big investment, putting one of these applications together. You've got a planning consultant, you've got the architect, you've got a landscape architect, and then you've got all these reports and surveys. It all adds up, and it's not for the faint-hearted, as we say. So you do need a client that understands that. But the first thing we have to do is find out whether the site has the right ingredients to get a planning consent. So I use the analogy of a set of weighing scales. So at the beginning, what we're trying to do is understand how heavy the weight is on the wrong side of the scales. So you're not allowed to build a house in the open countryside, we know that. If it's in Greenbelt, obviously you've got principle of openness to contend with. There's a very different strategy. Greenbelt exists for its openness, not its character. If the site's beautiful and in the Greenbelt, but has other buildings on it, you can potentially look at consolidating building form as a strategy. If there are no buildings there at all, it becomes very difficult in principle terms. Paragraph 89 of the NPPF, the policy framework, has a series of special circumstances in Greenbelt that can enable you to develop, or the development won't be inappropriate development. If it's area of outstanding natural beauty, national policy says at paragraph 115 that great weight shall be applied to protecting the natural beauty within AONBs. We have got planning consent on 4 of our 13 consents under this policy have been in AONBs. So it's possible, but these are highly protected pieces of land. It is more complex. So if it is any of those distinctions, then the weight is obviously heavier. If it's a triple SI, or if it's like Peppa Pig's house sitting on top of a hill, visible for miles, then any development is likely to have a big impact to significantly enhance the immediate setting and be sensitive to defining characteristics of the local area. If the defining characteristics are its openness and lack of development, if there's no opportunity to meet those tests, then we have to do that. So there was an appeal decision once that said of an AONB site that the site did not require significant enhancement. So it doesn't matter how good the scheme is, if the site didn't require significant enhancement, the opportunity to pass that test isn't there. So, on a lucky day, you never know, they might get the right planning officer, they might get the right inspector, and they might get the right decision. But that is one of those situations where we would say, that's not a robust case. That is very risky.
How risky are the ones that you take on then? Because there's always an element of risk, but I'm assuming what you're doing...
You can never guarantee planning consent.
You can't guarantee it, can you? But what you're doing is you're trying to manage that risk.
Absolutely right, yeah. So sometimes when we appraise a site, it's much closer to the middle. The balance is much closer to the middle. So that client, if you know a client that's got to commit their life's money to this, then we'll probably say, I don't think so. I don't think this is going to happen. But if somebody's very committed to just going and doing the very best and don't care how much it costs to get there, then that can sometimes tip the balance to sort of say, well, if we approach it in a certain way, if we promise more, could be a good chance. But back to the weighing scales. So once we've established the weight on the wrong side of the scales, we need to see on the opposite side of the scales, what opportunities exist within local and national policy to bring benefits that could come with a scheme. So the appraisal process we go through at the beginning is about trying to understand whether or not we can find those ingredients and articulate them. So it's not just a finger in the air, this site feels nice, this one feels good. It's a rigorous analysis of policy. If we come out of that process and say, I'm really sorry to shatter your dreams, really sorry, but we just can't see it happening, the client gets a strong sense as to why. Equally, if it's a positive appraisal, they will understand why we feel confident we could put the right case together. We don't do false positives because I don't want to be putting a case in that's kind of where the balance feels too level or too tipped the wrong way and hope that we might have a really nice planning officer or hope that we have a really good planning committee meeting. So it's got to be much more robust than that.
Take me through that, because I think at some point before this interview, you told me that you've actually sat on the other side. So,
well, yeah, I sit on design review panel. So one of the things that the National Planning Policy Framework endorsed and brought forward more, it was the use of design review panels. Planning officers are trained in planning, but they're not architects, they're not designers. So sometimes they need some help to understand the quality or not of proposals. So design review panels made up of architects, urban designers, landscape architects, engineers, can sit together and just talk about the virtues of a scheme and try and help schemes just improve quality and to communicate to planners whether or not something is meeting policy. Paragraph 55 is an unusual one because it's a design-led piece of policy. So you've got planning officers not trained in design needing advice on design. Hence why often paragraph 55 houses will be called in front of a design review panel. So I sit on the design review panel, so I get to review other paragraph 55 schemes. That's interesting.
Because I've seen ones that I thought, how did that get through? Say, for example, a classical building. I think this was quite recently. I saw it go through and just wondered why. Because in this day and age, given the things that you've said, surely that shouldn't. And if you would like a lovely classical building, there's nothing wrong with it, but there must be something you could save.
Well, the policy doesn't say you can't. PPS 7 paragraph 11 actually used the term contemporary architecture. So it was basically saying, it's gone from the English country house thing, and it's kind of said, no, we want it to be contemporary architecture, groundbreaking. It used the term very occasionally. So it was, these were quite difficult terms to prove that you can meet. And it's not necessarily appropriate for a scheme the word contemporary architecture is kind of quite loaded, I think. We had a scheme that we got planning consent for in the Greenbelt and the AOMB near Lingfield. The local authority refused it, so we had to go to appeal. And the inspector said to me during the appeal, "So, Mr. Hawkes, what makes this proposal outstanding?" And I said, well, in the sense of outstanding as opposed to, in the sense of standing out, the scheme isn't intended to be doing that. There are different types of paragraph 55 of PPS 7 house. Sometimes a location is right for a building that stands in contrast to its landscape, like an English country house, dominating its landscape, enhancing it, but very much in contrast to it, standing its ground, being proud to be there unapologetically. So you can call that the spaceship type PPS 7 house. Then I think there's another type of paragraph 55 house which takes the final two tests in bullet point 4 of paragraph 55. Well, the sensitivities to defining characteristics of the local area and significantly enhance the immediate setting, those two tests. So sometimes if you've got some quite strong influences on a building, existing, maybe listed buildings, maybe some really lovely quality architecture on the site already, it requires a more well-mannered response, something softer, something respectful, not copying, not apologetic, but understanding those qualities and working with them as part of the toolkit. So on our Greenbelt and AOMB site, that was part of what I was saying the architecture was doing. It was drawing upon the positive contributing qualities of some of these stable buildings that are on the site and reinforcing that quality, and at the same time getting rid of some of the buildings that were detractors, and consolidating development, helping to just enhance quality and just enhance the overall farmstead.
We're running out of time. Is there anything else, key points that we need to be grasping about this Para 55 that we haven't talked about?
Well, having sat on lots of design reviews, the thing that I've been quite surprised by is the lack of engagement in the defining characteristics of the local area. So often it's quite superficial, or it's not done, or often they're presenting a paragraph 55 application, but they've got no landscape architect.
What does a landscape architect bring? I have no contact with a landscape architect.
Their training's very different to the architect. The way they read a landscape is very different to the way an architect reads a landscape. We're very familiar with doing this process, so perhaps we've got a bit of a head start, but we would always, the day one site visit, we will be there with the landscape architects. We'll be walking all those footpath views, any of those sensitive views for a landscape visual assessment or an impact assessment. We will be out with them. We will spend lots of time on site. We'll wander around. We'll be treading the same ground. And what we do is little while after we've had that good time, long time on site, we'll have a workshop. And I've kind of got this rule that the pen's not allowed to touch the paper unless it's got a reason to be there. But what we do is we start laying down some do's and don'ts, some rules about the site, sensitivities, things that we need to avoid, things that we need to embrace, things that we can look at as an opportunity. And the landscape architect's there with us right at the beginning for that. So you don't design a house and then sort of say, oh, it could go here, here, or here. You don't design a house, put it there, and then say, landscape architect, can you design the garden around it? The rules about the site, everything that goes on that master plan will have a reason to be there. And it will be holistically robust because we've had all those skill sets there at the beginning. Bearing in mind, we wouldn't even be designing it if we hadn't done the appraisal and know that we feel we've got the right ingredients in place. So we're starting from a really solid foundation, and then we're just building this design process in a really strong way. We're not leaving any stone unturned, and everything is really robustly considered, which is why design process can be looked at wholly objectively.
Finally, then, we started this conversation actually by saying that there'd been a bit of a wobble in the road, saying that a couple of years after it was created, perhaps it was going to be abolished. We're 20 years in now. Do you think it will continue for a long time now? Is this a solid architectural route that's just getting so many interesting buildings that it will continue? I mean, how do you feel about that?
I do think it's a really important piece of policy, not just because my business is vested interest in it, but which it obviously does.
I'm sure you'd be fine if they stopped it tomorrow.
Yeah, I do. I have pondered this question often because it's an opportunity to push forward what dwelling design is all about. I think it's had its ups and downs, and you can look at various projects and sort of say, is it doing that? But I think it's a really important tool. Architects love the idea of doing a paragraph 55 house, and whilst they might struggle with it, some might struggle with it more than others, it's a great thing to have as an opportunity. I think it's a great test for design panels. I think it can really help architects understand how to respond to a setting. If architects are used to kind of working in the urban areas, and all of a sudden they're doing a building in a rural area, those tools need sharpening. And a piece of policy like this that really helps to say to the architects, well, this is what you've got to do. You've got these very clear messages in there. If you do that, you can get planning consent. So, but I think it helps. It's a good training mechanism for architects, and there have been some amazing buildings that have come out through the policy. But I think philosophically, as much as anything, if the policy weren't there, I'd find that quite a sad reflection on where we are with design, where we are as a country with architecture. Look at all these houses going up with no aspirational policy there. I find that quite a sad place to be, quite short-sighted and.
Don't worry, it's not going to happen. It was just.
No, I do. I feel it. I feel it'll be there for some time. But equally, I mean, I have thought about this. But eggs in baskets and all that type of thing. Ultimately, what we've developed over 9 years now is a portfolio of really diverse range of buildings and architectural styles, but also a really rigorous, robust framework for design. I mean, I think there's a book to be written about it. I think that the process that we've developed is something that was a really strong template.
Oh, it sounds like you got your next mission.
Oh, well, yeah, I haven't got time to do it, but
make the time. Right, Richard, I'm going to stop things there, wrap it up. Really appreciate your time and your insights in Para 55. Thank you.
Thank you.
The show notes that accompany this session are available online, houseplanninghelp.com/188, where we've summarised the main information. Also included a few photos of these Paragraph 55 projects, very spectacular. So if you haven't seen some of these before, they're always interesting. Go and have a look at some of Richard's. And if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can scroll down to the bottom of the show notes and do it there. We'll link you across to Hawks Architecture. Also let you know where you can find them on Twitter, houseplanninghelp.com/188. And it's normally right at the end of the podcast that I tell you about the hub, and I think I know exactly what I'm going to tell you about today because our first in-depth video case study was a Paragraph 55 build. Now, the idea behind these case studies is obviously I run a production company and I like making videos. And so we get down on site as much as possible and try and tell some of the stories. Slightly different from, say, an episode of Grand Designs. We're more interested in decisions and products and why we've gone down this specific route. So this is an insulated concrete formwork build. Alex Bain's really nice guy. We'll tell you all about Long Barrow. We chat to him on various different videos. So you can take a look at these. Just one of the features of the hub. We have our monthly progress calls, our courses, and also the community element as well. So you can get into the forum. Just find out more information about being a hub member at houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's your lot for today. Thank you for listening. Slightly longer than normal. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.